Hello and welcome to another episode of the Popcorn Conspiracy. I'm Dave G, and joining me tonight is my co-host.
Hello everybody, I'm Kyle.
And tonight we're going to be taking a look at the brand new crime thriller called Motherless Brooklyn. Of course, this is a book that's based on a novel by Jonathan Lethem, and it centers around a character called Lionel Esrog, played by Edward Norton, who is kind of a private investigator who works for a company owned by Frank Minner, played by Bruce Willis. And there's a couple of dodgy things going on there. Frank not only works as a private investigator, but he does blackmail people as well with information that he finds out about them. And Lionel is an interesting character because Lionel suffers from a mental illness. He has Tourette's, and a lot of people kind of just ignore him because of that. So it actually makes him the perfect private investigator. But when something happens to Frank, Lionel is left trying to investigate what has happened to his boss, and it soon plants him right in the middle of a political storm that he's going to have to work jolly hard to try and get to the bottom of and work out exactly what is happening. Now, mate, I found this to be a really, really interesting film because it didn't kind of follow the trend that a lot of films do these days and make it an easy watch for its audience. So what did you think of Motherless Brooklyn?
Yeah, dude, I agree. I love film noir detective movies set in this period, like the 1950s, 40s, like real back in the past. Movies like Chinatown or The Maltese Falcon, like it's definitely one of my favorite genres of film. And the book that this movie is actually based on was set in the 90s, but Edward Norton, as a writer and director of this movie, he decided, I think this would actually work well as a film noir. And yeah, he was definitely right about that. It really is an interesting film. Edward Norton, he really is a great actor, and I was very surprised to find out that this was only the second film that he's directed in the last 20 years. The other one was I think a romantic comedy with Jenna Elfman and Ben Stiller and him called Keeping the Faith.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was very surprised to find that this is the first movie that he's done in the last 20 years, because he's definitely an actor who's very hands-on with the projects that he takes on, and he's become somewhat infamous for interfering or being unhappy with the final product, like the stories about American History X, The Incredible Hulk. I've heard some stories about him working on a 25th Hour with Spike Lee and kind of giving his own directions to the actors, which kind of went against things that Spike Lee had told them to do. So it was just kind of, it's interesting that somebody like that, he hasn't worked on more films in sitting in the director's chair, because that seems to be where he seems really comfortable being in that position. Here, he really has managed to bring together really an impressive cast to tell this really, really interesting, compelling story, and with him at the center of it. But it doesn't feel at all like a shallow ego driven piece. Like, it doesn't feel like an ego movie at all. I believe all the other actors, that the great cast that he's put together for this movie, apparently they didn't actually, I think they all worked for free. Like, to keep the budget down. They really wanted to work with him on this movie, and he really has made this really interesting movie, this really interesting mystery film with starring quite an interesting character, which he plays himself. So yeah, what did you think of it, dude?
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this film. It sounds weird describing it in the same way because they're almost two entirely different movies, but I enjoyed this on the same level as I did The Departed. I love that whole intrigue kind of thing where you don't particularly know what's happening, and there's some great characters in here where you're like, well, which side are they on? Like, you've got the character of Paul, played by William Dafoe, who tries to help out Lionel, but at the same time, there seems like there's something sus about him. And then you've got Moses Randolph, played by Alec Baldwin, and it's like everyone seems to have a negative opinion of this guy, and it's like, could he really be as bad as what as what people are suggesting. Like, and it's almost kind of like mirror image, that it's like Alec Baldwin playing a part that almost feels like it's based on Trump as a businessman. Like, there's little bits in this movie that do things like that all the way through it. But even like with Lionel's colleagues, you're never really sure who you can trust. Like, and then when he sends out one of his colleagues and they get bashed, you're like, well, does that mean I can trust that guy? Because he got beaten up by the people that he was investigating. So I really love that, because I loved The Departed with that fact, like, that there's Leonardo DiCaprio's character doesn't know where he can turn to, because he doesn't know who's corrupt. He doesn't know who's working with who's talking to each other. And that's exactly the same thing with this film with Lionel. And then when he meets Laura Rose, played by Gugu Mbatha-Raw, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, well, is her life in danger, or is what he's being told kind of not true? And where does she tie into this? Like, why is her life in danger? I really like that aspect. And to his credit, Edward Norton, even with his screenplay here, he doesn't give anything away to his audience. There's no kind of like... it doesn't feel like he's teasing you with red herrings all the way through the film, and it doesn't feel like he's deliberately playing out parts and trying to stretch the film for dramatic effect. Like, there's scenes in this movie where it's nearly all dialogue, but he gets just as much suspense out of those dialogue scenes as what he does out of a scene where someone's got a gun. Like, it's an amazing film for me. Like, I think for me it's going to be one of those most underrated movies of the year.
Yeah, I really did enjoy it. It's a 2.5 hour film, and it's very dense. There's so many characters and so many things going on, and it's quite easy to become lost in the story and maybe not really quite know what's going on sometimes. And I do like movies like that sometimes, because it gives more reason to go back and rewatch them a second time. And I really like that with these kind of detective movies as well. Like, because whereas with something like, well, personally from myself with Knives Out, I didn't really find the mystery of that movie to be all that interesting, and I thought the movie was funny, but there's not really a whole lot that's going to really pull me back towards that movie to watch it again. This movie, I think something with the best detective movies is that even if you don't really quite grasp the plot, what's going on the first time, they're interesting enough to get you to want to come back and again, to watch them again and again. Yeah. Like, I felt that with Chinatown. The first time that I watched Chinatown, I didn't know what the hell was going on. I mean, I was much younger than I am now, and I actually hated it the first time that I watched it. It's like the ending, how abruptly it ends, things like that. But there was just something really interesting and compelling about the film that made me want to go back and watch it. Now it's one of my favorite detective movies. I got the same kind of feeling from this movie that I did from that. Even though there's so much going on, so much of it's kind of you become kind of lost in the story. A lot of there's a lot of threads that kind of remain not quite tied up at the end, because there's just kind of so many different things going on that the movie could maybe go on for another half hour. It could be a 3-hour movie, but then maybe it would overstay its welcome. But just the way that it played out was very interesting and very very compelling. And I really did like just the way that all went. I've got more to say about Edward Norton, but what did you think of? Well, Edward Norton is the primary focus, and his kind of how he portrayed somebody with Tourette's in a time when people didn't even know what it was. They just think it's, he's got demons in his head or something like that. What did you think of that, dude?
Yeah, I really thought he did it in a really, really good way. I get a kind of feeling that some of his Tourette's in this movie was kind of ad-libbed, because there was a couple of times here where people laughed, like, and it works, like, people are laughing at him, but just the reaction of the actors around him, it felt kind of more like, you know how when you've got a talk show or something on and you've got like someone with Tourette's and they react, and like the hosts try not to laugh, but they do. It kind of had that feeling in this movie sometimes, so I kind of get the feeling that he gave himself a little bit of a license with Tourette's, but I kind of also like the fact that he doesn't overplay it. I find a lot of times when people do a movie and they portray somebody with a disability or a mental illness, they'll overplay it. Like they kind of forget about. I think it should be compulsory for everybody who plays a character with a disability to go back and watch My Left Foot and Rain Man for the two perfect performances on how to play somebody with a mental illness or a physical illness. And yeah, I think Edward Norton does a brilliant job here. Like there's times in this movie where you kind of almost forget that he's acting it. Like, it almost feels like, oh no, he really has that, because of just how well he does it and how natural it just flows into a scene as well. So, obviously, some of it is scripted because there's reactions to what he's saying, but there's even times here where he does it in front of Bruce Willis, and I swear you see Bruce Willis smile a couple of times where it's kind of like, oh, you caught me out there, like I wasn't expecting you to say that. So, look, I think Edward Norton, I think, is brilliant in this movie. Like, to me, this is kind of like one of those movies when Ben Affleck directs himself. I think there's some actors out there that don't have that ability to direct themselves, but Ben Affleck has always done it pretty well, and I think Edward Norton throws himself into that realm with this performance as well, because he puts in a performance that could easily be an award-winning performance at the same time while he's directing a movie that deserves to be an award-winning film.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that it never really comes off like he's really pushing it, or it never comes off like I'm acting, which, like, exactly like you said with Ben Affleck in movies that he directs himself, that he stars in, he's not like overly playing up the part, you know, like it's not like really the cliche of an actor who's directing themselves and starring in a movie, kind of like there was it was in the Mr. Bean's Holiday movie where it was actually Willem Dafoe was in that movie playing this actor who had written and directed and produced and was starring in his own little indie film, and it was just so boring and so egocentric, and it was all about him, and like you don't get that at all here with what Edward Norton's done here. Not from his performance or anything. Like he's as you say, he's a great actor, and like he might be really focused and sure of himself, maybe even arrogant in real life, but like he plays these relatable, beaten down characters so well.
Yeah.
And like having a detective movie based entirely around a guy with Tourette's, like it sounds kind of like a bad idea. Like I would have expected it to get really irritating after a while, but it never does.
Yeah.
Like again, it's a 2.5 hour film. Nearly every conversation, almost all of it's focused on him. Nearly every conversation he has in the film, he has some kind of physical or verbal tic or outburst, but it never gets tired or boring. And it really helps the story and his character that this is a guy who has a photographic memory, and he should be like a perfect private investigator with the abilities that he has, but he's kind of held back because of his affliction, and this is kind of him coming out of his shell, doing interviews and things he'd normally be kept away from, not because Bruce Willis's character was trying to keep him safe or protect him or anything, but it was something that there were better equipped people that didn't have the problems to do that job that he was faced with. But yeah, like it was really interesting in this movie again that this was a time when there wasn't really much understanding of Tourette's. There wasn't any real treatment for it. In this movie, he treats himself by chewing gum or getting stoned, just kind of home remedies, really. But it was